The Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean, and when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been waiting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some signs. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. The same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas to us." This was a man who had been put in prison for insurrection that had taken place in the city, and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they had wished. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. If he is the Messiah, the Son of God, the chosen one, let him come down from the cross." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him some wine and saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." There was an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds had gathered there for the spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
He stirs up the people by his teaching. Throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he began, and even to this place. So say the chief priests and the scribes, which begin this Holy Week. What does it mean to stir up? Well, the dictionary definition, one of them, the one that matters most to us, is to cause someone to feel a strong emotion and desire to do something. Some synonyms for this are to enliven, to quicken, to stimulate, to trigger, to excite, to activate, to incite, to provoke, to agitate. Now, stirring up can have both negative and positive results. One can be stirred to anger and revenge by powerful speakers, whereas Jesus often stirred people to compassion and good works. Holy Week has begun, and Jesus has been stirring things up. Another translation for that is shaking, as in an earthquake. Jesus has been shaking things up, continues to do so. And so we enter Holy Week. Last year, I missed it so much. The second Holy Week, practically ever since I'd been a Christian. I had never missed at least one service. I'd always attended at least one service during Holy Week. And most of the time I was able to go to all of them. It has been such a meaningful part of my Christian life, to walk with Jesus to the cross. And last year, it was the second year in a row that I could not gather with God's people to worship during this holiest of weeks. I was bereft. And as grateful as I am for the technology, Zoom and YouTube and television services are not the same. And I'm sure most of us know that. This year, however, given all that we have been through with the pandemic and all the shaking and stirring that that's done, and now with the situation in the Ukraine, I wonder if I'm up for it. I wonder if I'm ready to experience the stirring and the shaking up of this week. Hasn't there been enough anxiety and sadness and loneliness and grief? And with Ukraine, the outrage and the tears, the sense of moral indignation. Our emotions have been in a state of being shaken up and stirred for more than 2 years. Haven't we been stirred up enough? Dare I be shaken even more by going through this week attentively, by immersing myself in the story that not only shakes me, but shapes me still, even as well as I know the story. Jesus' teachings have always shaken things up, and the leaders don't like it one bit. Oh, it was bad enough when he was out and about in the countryside and throughout Judea, but now he has brought it close. He has brought it to the holy city. He's operating on their turf. And Jerusalem is trembling with his words, and they feel threatened. They do not realize that what they fear most is the active presence of God in Jesus the Christ. They want to keep it at a safe and comfortable distance, or destroy it if they can't. Jesus is indeed shaking things up, and the status quo is threatened. Yes, we may well be exhausted by all the relentless stirring of the last 2+ years, but still we are called to turn our attention to this Holy Week, 2022, to be stirred and shaken even more. And we gain strength for this journey from our privileged perspective from this side of the cross. As people of faith, we know that those who wanted to bring Jesus stirring up to a quiet, if not brutal end, failed miserably. We know how the story ends. But we can still be stirred once again as we enter this story, as Luke tells it. Think of the garden, when Jesus' anguished prayer is so intense that his sweat turns to drops of blood. And imagine, while he is literally on his knees begging that his cup might be taken from him, begging for his life, that his closest friends cannot stay awake with him. How does that picture stir you? Can you imagine the approaching crowd, that snaking line of torches moving towards the garden and being led by one of Jesus' closest friends? Can you imagine Peter's angry response and Jesus, ever the healer and the peacemaker, reaching out and healing the slave's ear? Then Jesus being led away roughly like a common criminal, but he is a prized criminal. And then Peter, oh so quickly, denying his Lord, his bravado and the devotion crumbling in fear for his life. Surely we are stirred and shaken by these images, and we know it gets worse. The mocking, the blindfolding, the insults. Jesus standing alone without counsel before the chief priests and the scribes. In the trial before Pilate, his silence before Herod. The accusations, the contempt, the ridicule, the humiliation, the flogging. Could those who participated in his arrest and violent death have possibly imagined that the story of their brutality would be told more than 2,000 years later and would be stirring us still? They had no idea, because they thought they were bringing the story, the shaking, to an end. Then the release of Barabbas and the bloodthirsty shouting to crucify him. The flogging, the agonizing walk to Golgotha, the place of a skull. The wailing women in anguish for what they are witnessing. Can we imagine him stumbling and falling? Simon of Cyrene being compelled to help him carry his own cross. Even now, for you and for me, who have read and heard and seen all of this hundreds of times, we are quaking again, are we not? As we listen to his promise of paradise to the crook hanging next to him, in the darkness at high noon, in his loud shout, committing himself into God's care as he dies, and the brave proclamation of the centurion as he breathed his last. Are we not stirred? And those who claimed his body, wrapping it tenderly in linen and carrying it to an empty tomb, while the faithful women followed behind, noting where he had been laid. Certainly, we are reminded now, beyond a doubt, because we sense it too, again, this year. Jesus' teachings may have stirred things up among the people as he talked about a new and truer way. But if those who thought they could end it all by how they treated him, by what they had done in this week, well, we know that the earthquake had just begun. In truth, the whole world is still shaking with the power of Jesus and the words that he spoke and the teachings that we still try to follow. Now, I suspect for many of us faithful Christians at this point in our journey through Lent, We would rather just fast forward to the happy ending of the story. We would rather experience that earthquake on Easter morning that signifies the victory of life over death, of God's world-altering presence in the world that opened that tomb. We are aching for that resurrection morning. We are aching to read of the women and Peter running to see it for himself. And I have to wonder if that's why we are reading the passage story today, rather, I think, because a lot of people don't come to church on Good Friday because it is just so sad. This year especially, that longing to get to the finish line, I think, is more than understandable. There's been too much suffering, too much brutality, too much cruelty, too much upheaval, and too much loss. No wonder we can't wait for the sunrise that follows. Nonetheless, I think this year we need to hunker down and hang in there more than ever, because this story is ongoing and offers more than tragedy and betrayal and ridicule and beating and suffering and death. Because we need to hold fast to those images that stir us with gratitude and hope, even in the midst of all that went on in this week. That was so hard for us to contemplate, so hard for us to revisit. There are scenes of incredible beauty, of God's grace and tenderness in the midst of the horror. Jesus sharing a meal with his beloved children, which his beloved children remember still until the end of time. Jesus offering forgiveness to his detractors and executioners. Jesus listening to the plea of the one hanging beside him, and in his last breaths offering him a promise he intends for us all. Even now, before that longed-for Easter morning, we can see achingly beautiful things which are shaking our souls and stirring us to keep faith, because they are the signs of the living God at work in the world, despite of and in the midst of all the ugliness in the world. God is still at work. It has been my privilege as a pastor to keep vigil with the dying and their loved ones many, many times over the past 28 years. And in ministering to those loved ones as their loved one is dying, and then later as they grieve, they tell me of how hard it is to be there as they watch the life ebb away from the person so dear to them. But they also say, I couldn't not have been there. They had to be there. And we need to be there with our Lord throughout this week. We now await that final Easter, when all tears are wiped away and when death and crying are no more, when pandemics are unheard of and when wars are done with forever. All those things who have made us quake and stirred us with anxiety and fear and anger and grief, they will be done for. In this holiest of weeks, when we sense God's mighty works at work, even in the awfulness of it all, we are inspired to claim in this week that promise of Jesus, that promise that we pray for every Sunday. God's will be done. Despite all the sadness and sorrow and suffering, God's will be done. God's kingdom will come. Because as always and forever, God has the final word. And it is a good word. Amen. Our hymn of the day, There in God's Garden.